Alright, so this is our second video on working with BeautifulSoup so that we can pull this list of the worst video games off of Wikipedia. There is one change to my code I want to note, is that I went from having used the find method to the having used the find all method to the find method from BeautifulSoup, and so it was just a change that needed to happen because I want to find this div, right? This particular div right here, and its ID, or its ID is talk table of contents. And then from there, what we're going to do is, now that we've gotten this div, what we need are these ULs, and these ULs contain list items, right? So it's an unordered list element with a bunch of list items inside, and those list items are the decades, and then underneath the decades we have every title, as you can see that being selected over there on the left as I'm scrolling down, right? So once we've got our table of contents, we can actually kind of drill down into the element and get these list items. So that's what we're going to do next. And in order to do that, we're going to take our table of contents, which we can see over here. We get a bunch of stuff, right, including the div, and then we've got all these LIs. And so what we want to do is we want to find those LIs just to get the titles that have a class of talk level 2. So again, utilizing that documentation from the BeautifulSoup library, I can look up and see that I can do that pretty easily. So I'm going to get game titles, and that's going to be talk.findAll this time. So now I'm going to find all the list items that have a class of talk level 2. So there's a pattern in all these talk levels where we can see each is class talk level 2. We don't have to worry about this talk section 3, that's irrelevant for right now. We just want to find this talk level 2, and that's going to give us all the titles. I'll run my code again, and then I will come down here and I'll say, all right, let's make sure we got what we needed. It's kind of crazy looking, but if we look closely, we see we've got a list of titles. And in fact, to make that even clearer, a lot of times what I will do with my code is I'll come over here and I'll say, like, for title in game titles, print title. And then what that will give us is a little easier to read version, but it's still got all this extra HTML stuff. So we're seeing that. I'll clear this out so we can see it clearly. So we get all of the titles, right? But it's still surrounded by all this HTML, so it makes it hard to read. And so instead we'll just do title.text. And that's going to give us an actual readable output. And so here we see very clearly all those titles and the year that they were released as well. So now what we want to do is we want to isolate the title and the year, okay? And that might seem really intimidating because how do we pull that stuff out of the string? However, there's a pretty simple solution. We should notice that each of these titles is and I'll pull out an example of this here. So we'll take title 0, and that's a tag. If I say type game titles 0.text, it'll tell me it's a string. Okay, so it is a string, and that means we can work with it like a string, which also means we can use slices. Now, if you don't remember anything about slices, I'll just do a quick reminder. If I have a string like snake, and I want only the first 2 letters, I could say something like 0. I want snake 0 through 3. That's going to give me the first 3 letters because I'm getting index 0, 1, 2, and not 3. So I get all the way up to 3, 0, 1, 2. If I say I want snake from index 1 all the way up to the end, for example, I could write that, and that's going to give me nake. So slices are a way of taking chunks out of strings. You can also do this with lists, even though we're not really concerned with that right now. So this is going to give us just the number 1 because that's index 0 up to 1 of this little list we just made. So that's a slice. And we can use that to isolate this data from our game titles. How do we do that? Well, we're going to do a couple of things here. The first thing is we need a place to hold that information. So we're going to use our for loop here still, and we're going to make a game title variable. And then we've got to figure out like what should our chunk of the text be. So I'm going to try this. Actually, let's do this first. Let's take another look at these titles, just so we get a clearer picture of what's going on. Okay, so if I look at this, I can figure out what index do I want to get this data from. Okay, and for the most part, everything starts on index, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3. So we would want to get from index 4 all the way to something. It's kind of hard to know exactly where we would end up because you can see all of these have different lengths. So it's kind of hard to say like, well, what index do I stop at when I'm getting the title out? But we'll try this out. We're going to say title.text. We'll get everything from 4 on. And let's see what we get now. Okay, so here's our output. We get, for most of them, we get the correct output. These that have like a double-digit number before them, those don't work out exactly correctly, but we'll be able to fix that pretty easily with some data cleanup later on with a strip method. So there you go. We got all the titles, with the exception of cutting off the date here. So then, hopefully, we can observe this pattern that the year has a consistent format, right? It's parentheses, year, parentheses, and then there's a space before we get to the title. And so you might remember that in Python, strings and lists have negative index as well, where we can work from the left to the right, or excuse me, from the right to the left. So if we have something like snake, and we say, what is snake -1? That's E. What is snake -2? K. And so now we can actually work backwards and think about how we could have the second part of this slice be a negative value, which is okay. So we could say, like, all right, we've got index -1, -2, -3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So I think what I want is the title.text from index 4 up to index -7. Let's see what happens when we run this. All right. Let me clear my console. I'll run it again just so it's extra clear. So now you can see I've got all these titles for the most part without the date or the year on the end. Now there is an issue here where there was like a range of years, and we're not going to worry about that right now. There's always going to be some kind of like little issue with your data that you can probably correct with some specific code, but in our case we're not going to fool with that too much for right now. We just want to isolate the title. So here's what we can do. In order to get rid of this white space, we're going to use the strip method, and we can store everything in game title. So we're going to say game title is going to be title.text 4 through -7, and then we'll call the strip method to get rid of any white space. And now we'll just print game title and make sure that this idea works. Okay, so for the most part, it works. Again, we've got a few examples where it's not working out correctly, but we can see we got rid of the white space. And so now the goal is we want to get the year. All right, so if we want to get the year, we need to get those last 5 or 6 indexes, whatever it is, that contain the year. So let's print off our title in whole again, title.text. We don't really need that anymore, but it's printing it off each time. That's okay. So again, we just have to observe where is this year, and we'll see that it's -1, -2, -3, 4, 5, and 6. So basically, we want everything from index -6 to the end, or actually not index -6, but -5, because we don't want these parentheses. They're pretty useless. So we want everything from -5 up to but not including -1. All right, so let's do game year. That's going to be title.text, everything from -5 up to -1. And then we'll print game year. So let's see what we get now. Okay, it looks pretty good. right? We've basically isolated the year with there's one exception where we've got this weird Zelda thing going on, but it's somewhat correct, so that's helpful. And so now we've isolated this data. In the next video, which we'll talk about next week, we're going to learn how we can use a named tuple to keep track of this data in a class-like manner, which is really handy.